Good morning, everyone. All right, I think we can get started. So today we're going to be continuing with our discussion of edges and boundaries that we started on Tuesday. If you recall, the last topic that we were talking about was edge effects. And I would like for somebody to volunteer to recap for us what edge effects are.
It's basically the change of the ecosystem from the interior habitat to where the edge is. So there's a different type of species and different plants growing.
Yep, that's part of it. That's more the definition of an ecotone. So, but what are edge effects specifically? What do we mean when we're referring to edge effects? And you're part of the way there, Annie, if you want to try to drive that bus a little further.
Maybe more like the changing resources and conditions of that area.
Yeah, so that's a big part of it. It's essentially the impact that external forces outside of that particular habitat or patch have on the edges of that patch. So that's the edge effect. And there was another concept that we talked about, if I go back here, right? So we talked about how edge effects influence the conditions on the edge of a patch. And then we also talked about the distance of edge influence, right? So I'll skip over that. Who wants to recap what the distance of edge influence is?
Wasn't that just like how big the edge is before you really get to the interior?
Exactly. It's basically how far into that patch do the edge effects impact the environmental conditions in that patch. So that depth of edge influence is what determines where the interior habitat stops and where the edge or ecotone habitat starts. All right. So having discussed everything we have so far about edges, we're going to finish the discussion of edges by examining some of the functional aspects of edges within a landscape mosaic. So perhaps first and foremost, edges influence the movement of organisms across a landscape. As we've previously seen, edges can amplify, attenuate, or deflect movement of individual species and organisms, depending on the specific characteristics of that edge, right? So we talked earlier about how having a more curvilinear edge that's got a wider boundary is going to promote movement across the landscape and across that edge, whereas a sharper boundary that has a greater distinction between the two habitat types is going to inhibit movement, right? So if we imagine these white arrows here as a movement of an animal, you can see how it would be easier for an organism to kind of make its way into this forest patch from this more open area because of the gradual transition that it needs to move through, as opposed to an organism that's moving through this forested landscape on the bottom and comes up to this very sudden and dramatic barrier and would tend to move along that barrier as opposed to venturing out into that very different type of environment. So edges provide access to resources and the conditions of the adjacent ecological environment and systems. Edges also delineate resources and conditions that influence and define the distribution of different organisms. So edges are really important in terms of thinking about how they influence where organisms live and the types of organisms that you'll find in the different environments. Edges also provide access to many of the resources and conditions that are needed to support the life cycle of various species. So many species, even those that are adapted to interior habitats, need edges to complete some portion of their life cycle, such as feeding or nesting, while others may be specifically adapted to the conditions that are prevalent along those edges. And that's why edges are areas of such high biodiversity, because they're not only accommodating the species that are adapted to those edge conditions, but they also provide some of the resources needed by the interior species that will occasionally be found in those edge habitats. Edges also serve as filters or buffers for movement of energy and materials. When you have a wide edge or ecotone, for example, can help to dampen the negative edge effects of adjacent landscape types in the interior, right? And so this is basically just a diagram representing that those edges are going to help to act as an attenuation from the effects of one ecosystem or landscape type on an adjacent ecosystem or landscape type. So here we have an example where the edges of the grassland are helping to protect and buffer the sensitive riparian habitat that we see along the river banks here from the negative influences of the adjacent agricultural land. And this is a typical type of conservation practice that you'll find in many places. Specifically, wetlands and riparian landscapes often require a buffer area of a certain distance that's to be left in a more natural condition to help protect that resource from the influence of the adjacent activities. And different places have different requirements. So for example, in much of New England, where there's very little wetland left because that area has been developed for so many hundreds of years at this point, they have some of the most stringent buffer requirements in the country. So you need a minimum of 200 feet of buffer area around any kind of protected wetland or riparian zone. And many municipalities actually go above and beyond that, and some places have 400 or 500 feet required, which is a pretty considerable distance to have as a protected area around a wetland. In Colorado, does anyone know what the state limitation or what the state minimum is for buffer area around a wetland or riparian zone?
I'll guess 100 feet.
Nope, that's a good guess, but it's actually less than that.
20 feet.
That's very close. It's actually 25 feet. So much less, obviously, than in places like Massachusetts, where it's 200 feet, almost 1/10 the requirement that you have in places like Massachusetts. But again, there are many municipalities who will either impose stricter buffer requirements based on the specific conditions of that wetland, or just in general as an additional requirement that goes above and beyond what the state requires. So Colorado is a mere 25 feet buffer distance as the minimum. This is another example in this diagram that shows the filtering or buffering effect of edges. And in this case, the administrative or legal boundary of a protected ecological reserve does not coincide with a natural edge, and it creates an entirely new ecotone of sorts. And that protects the interior of the reserve from external development threats and other human activity. Right, so in this case, that stream corridor would probably be creating a more natural type of an edge for that interior of the reserve. But they've created this sort of additional buffer area with this administrative boundary that, that provides additional protection for both the stream and the interior of that reserve. Right, and again, this is going to help to protect from any influences of any development or agriculture or whatever human activities might be happening on the other side of that boundary. All right, so that concludes our section on edges. Are there any questions about edges and boundaries before we move on to our next topic? All right, I'll take that as a no. Let's close this out. And now we will be moving on to our next topic, which is corridors. All right, so we did briefly touch on corridors all the way back in lecture 4 earlier in the semester, but we're going to be talking about them now in more detail and thinking about some of their characteristics as they relate to patches and networks and mosaics and so forth. So we'll begin with a brief overview of the terminology. As a reminder, a corridor in landscape ecology terms is described as a narrow patch that may act as a link or barrier in the landscape, influencing the dispersal of plants and animals. Right, and in this photo below, we see all sorts of corridors in the landscape. In this case, they're remnant hedgerows in the UK that serve as dividing lines between agricultural fields. So let's look at some of the origins of landscape corridors and where they come from. Vegetative corridors arise in the landscape as a result of one or more 5 general causes. These include environmental corridors, remnant corridors, disturbance corridors, planted corridors, and conservation corridors. And we're going to take a look at what each of those means. So first we'll start with environmental corridors, which result from unique environmental conditions occurring in a linear or meandering geometry. Essentially, it means that the plant community is growing in a particular linear area because of favorable growing conditions that can be found there that are lacking in the larger matrix. These types of corridors are nearly always associated with hydrology, And they have an abundance of plants growing in moist soils along rivers and streams. They're typically referred to, of course, as riparian corridors in these natural conditions. Right. So in this photo, we see an example of a riparian corridor and the sort of much more lush plant life that you typically have associated with that, and it forms sort of a distinct contrast to the sort of suburban development that's going on around it. So that's the first type, environmental corridor. Next, we have remnant corridors. These are the result of human development patterns that leave behind remnants of native habitat that once stood in that area. So essentially, as humans are chopping up the landscape into farms and housing subdivisions and other uses, the interstitial areas between those developments may remain as remnant corridors. So this is very much similar to the idea of remnant patches, where it's just something that's left over as a result of human development patterns. And in this case, we see a remnant corridor left behind in between these patches of agriculture that have been developed. Next, we have disturbance corridors, and these are sometimes referred to as trough corridors. And these are the result of some type of human disturbance in a linear geometry. These types of corridors generally act as a barrier in the landscape, depending upon the level of maintenance, and they can complicate wildlife movement across the landscape. This type of corridor creates a hostile gash through an otherwise functional habitat. And these disturbance corridors are generally only populated by disturbance adapted plant and animal species, right? So the hardiest of species that prefer edge conditions or areas of disturbance that are not particularly hospitable to other species, they're going to be populated just by those disturbance adapted species. Oftentimes, these corridors have higher populations of exotic and invasive species as well, due to the continuous high level of human usage and impact, right? So here we have one example where we have power lines moving through an area of landscape, and it's breaking up two forest patches, dividing those in two, and creating a corridor that in this case is acting as a barrier rather than a conduit in the landscape. Next, we have planted corridors, and these refer to instances where humans have designed and planted rows or buffers of trees or other plants as an aesthetic device or as a buffer to block unpleasant views or sounds, such as the noise impacts from a highway. The intent of a planted corridor is to benefit humans, but also actually provides unintended benefits for wildlife. In this case, we're looking at a portion of Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, which is a major thoroughfare in downtown Boston. It's a fairly wealthy area of the city, and they have this wide central median that's planted pretty densely with trees and provides habitat for animals like squirrels and birds and chipmunks, and provides a way for those species to move from patch to patch as they're moving through the city. Again, this was intended as a grand pedestrian promenade, but that mature tree canopy is also providing habitat for animals as well, and a conduit for animals to move through the city. Who can provide a good example of a similar type of planted corridor in Fort Collins?
The Oval.
The Oval is a good example. What else? If we're talking about a street specifically.
College has it in a lot of spots, doesn't it?
College has it in a few spots. There's one street in particular I'm thinking of that has it for pretty much its entire length. Anyone? There's a trolley line that runs along that street. Mountain Ave? If anyone's walked along Mountain Ave west of Old Town, pretty much the entire stretch from the cemetery all the way to Old Town is continuously planted with a central median with mature trees in it. So that's another example of a planted corridor that we have right here in town. Next, we have conservation corridors, and a conservation corridor is one that's designed and created specifically for the purpose of providing movement and habitat corridors for various species of wildlife. And these corridors are generally carefully designed to provide the specific resources that are needed by one or more of the species that are the target of the local conservation effort. So in this example, we are seeing a what's known as a wildlife bridge. And so this is providing access and connection between the patches that we see on either side of that highway so that wildlife can move across that barrier. Highways are actually one of the most destructive types of disturbance corridors that we find in the landscape. So in this case, we have the disturbance corridor of the highway that prevents wildlife from moving across it, and then a conservation corridor that's intended to bridge the gap created by that disturbance corridor. So we have a crossing of two different types of corridors in this particular situation. And typically when they're designing these conservation corridors, they're thinking about specific species that they're trying to encourage migration and movement of, and they will design those wildlife bridges or other conservation corridors specifically to meet the needs of those species, so that encourages those species to use that wildlife corridor. So here we have a combination of different types of corridors resulting from human disturbance to the background matrix. And this includes hedgerows, a riparian corridor, and possible remnant corridors in the distance. Corridor structure can be narrow as a single line of plants, such as a hedgerow, or it can be much wider, like a multi-row windbreak, or it can have other configurations that can be a little bit more complex in terms of the structure, like the one that we have along this riparian corridor. And in fact, the next topic that we'll be talking about is corridor attributes. So regardless of the origins of the corridor, there's a number of attributes of those corridors that landscape ecologists use to understand and quantify those corridors and assess their functionality within the landscape mosaic. So vegetative corridors have three basic attributes, and these are width, composition, and length. And we'll look at each of these in more detail so that we can understand their impact on overall corridor structure and function. First, we'll begin with width. And the width of a corridor, of course, is a measure of the distance across the corridor perpendicular to its prevailing directionality. And the width has several characteristics associated with it. The first is known as core area, and that means the environmental conditions at the center line of the corridor. In some cases, like in the example in this diagram, the core is entirely different from the habitat type, or is an entirely different habitat type, such as a stream. And that creates the good kind of landscape heterogeneity with a variety of ecosystem conditions present that can support a wide diversity of wildlife. Right, so in this case, we have an active stream channel in the center, and then we have a riparian zone on either edge, which is that habitat that directly buffers that body of water. And then we have edges to those riparian zones where edge effects are going to be prevalent from whatever the mosaic is around that, or rather the matrix around that riparian corridor. The next characteristic of width is adjacencies, which means the landscape types that are bumping directly up against the exterior edges of the corridor. In human modified landscapes, that's often agricultural land or domesticated landscapes. The nature of the adjacent landscape is going to have a strong influence over the quality of the corridor habitat. So if you have a heavily urbanized adjacent land use, for example, that's going to have a much more profound and deleterious impact on the core than other types of adjacencies. And again, that has to do with the level of contrast that you have between that edge of the corridor and then the adjacent landscape type. The final characteristic is the edge condition, or the ecotones that are formed between the corridor and the adjacent landscape types. The wider those ecotones are, the more protection that the core landscape type will have, and the corridor can function more effectively and be a much more sustainable connection within the landscape. Right, so again, it's going to be that the width of those edges is going to help to buffer that interior area from the edge effects. And that's why those buffer areas are so important, particularly when we're talking about corridors, because they help to protect that resource at the center and also provide a much more functional conduit for wildlife to move across the landscape. The composition of the corridor refers to its abiotic materiality. When you have a naturalized corridor, that's typically going to consist of soil and bedrock, but in a man-made corridor, the material substrate of the corridor, for example, may be concrete, like the example that we see in this channelized waterway. And does anyone know which channelized waterway we're looking at in this photo?
That Los Angeles?
That is Los Angeles. Yeah, probably one of the most famous channelized waterways in the world. This is the LA River, and it's channelized for pretty much its entire length and provides absolutely no sort of wildlife benefit whatsoever. It's strictly designed for moving water as quickly as possible out of the city. So this is showing that, and I will say that there are some advocacy groups that have been promoting trying to create more naturalized edges for the LA River waterway and channel, and they have had a couple of projects where they've done some plantings. It's very sporadic, so it's not really doing much yet, but they're moving towards a goal of having the entire thing have a more naturalized and vegetated edge to it instead of having this hardened concrete channel. Let's see. Right, so this photo down here is an example of one portion of the LA River that's been naturalized. So in this case, sorry, and again, as always, come on, mouse. My zoom menu is always in the way. There we go. So this is a photo that's showing a portion of the LA River that they've naturalized with plantings along the edges, trees at the top of the berm on either side, and then I'm creating some pockets of soil and other materials that can support plantings in the center. And so this is the type of thing that they're hoping to do along the length of the river once resources and funding becomes available. There we go. And then finally, the last aspect of corridors that we're going to look at is the corridor length. And that refers to the distance that that corridor traverses across the matrix from the patch or terminus at one end of the corridor to the other. Length characteristics include things like breaks, nodes, narrows, curvilinearity, and connectivity. So this image that we see here illustrates a few of those characteristics. A break is basically just a point of discontinuity in the corridor where the matrix creates an interruption. And although it can be an impediment to wildlife, the impact of a break can be minimal if the distance isn't too great. That's something that we saw when we were doing our GIS exercise with the chipmunks in City Park, that as long as that break in continuity of habitat isn't too wide, that animals can still use it to traverse the landscape. Nodes are points where a corridor branches or where multiple corridors intersect. And a high density of nodes in a corridor network can indicate a high level, sorry about that. It can indicate a high level of wildlife residency in the network with multiple pathways available for wildlife movement. So the more nodes you have, the greater the connectivity of the overall network and the more choices that wildlife will have in moving through that network of corridors. And the greater that connectivity, obviously, the more resilient that network is going to be and the greater the movement of animals across that landscape. Narrows, on the other hand, are just what they sound like. They're places where the overall width of the corridor is reduced. And narrows, of course, tend to impede the movement of species and energy and tend to be danger points for prey species where they're most vulnerable to attack by predators because there's the greatest exposure to the matrix at those points. Curvilinearity refers to the degree of meander of the corridor. As we saw in the last lecture on edges, a more meandering edge tends to encourage greater penetration through that edge. And the same is true of corridors. So if you have a more meandering corridor, it's more likely that species will be able to move across that corridor as opposed to moving along it. And then finally, the connectivity refers to the degree to which the corridor or network of corridors facilitates or impedes movement between resource patches. In other words, it's the relative ease with which wildlife can move from one patch to another. The greater the connectivity, the greater the overall function of the landscape mosaic, and the greater it is providing, the greater the degree of habitat is providing for a wide variety of species, right? So we're really looking at how well connected all those corridors are within the landscape to assess the overall functionality of that landscape. Next, we'll look at corridor function, and corridors fulfill several crucial functions within the landscape mosaic, which we will take a closer look at. Corridor function can be broken down into 5 broad categories. The first one is habitat. A corridor can function as habitat or as a component of a habitat, particularly for species with small home ranges and limited mobility. So as the first diagram shows, species may be edge or core adapted, at least for species that don't require a substantial core habitat. In this sense, the corridor acts as an elongated patch, right? So it's basically acting as a long, skinny patch that can support various species that don't need a lot of interior habitat. A corridor can also serve as a transitional habitat during seasonal migrations between patches. So particularly for animals that are moving long distances in their migrations, corridors can be a temporary stopover in that migration and serve temporarily as a habitat area. The second category of corridor function, and the one that most people probably associate with corridors, is that a corridor can act as a conduit. A corridor conveys energy, water, nutrients, genes, seeds, organisms, and other materials from one patch to another. And this is the this is the functional category that we're most often thinking about when we think about landscape ecology, because this is the one that impacts decisions that we make about land use and how to create the best connectivity between patches when we're designing large land areas. The third functional category is as a filter or barrier. Corridors function as a filter when it intercepts organisms with only a percentage of those actually passing through that barrier, but it can also intercept and filter abiotic and atmospheric elements such as wind, wind-blown particles, and surface water. Corridors may filter out sediments and agricultural chemicals from runoff that originates in the adjacent matrix. So if you imagine a corridor along a riparian area that's bordered by agricultural land, all of the runoff coming from that agricultural land can be filtered by the edges of that corridor so that they don't pollute the waterway that's traveling in between those agricultural lands. They can also act as barriers that reduce wind velocity and decrease erosion. In the case of roads, the corridor can be a potentially deadly barrier that inhibits the movement of organisms across the landscape, right? So roadways, particularly highways, are going to be a huge barrier that prevents wildlife from moving from a patch on one side of that highway to a patch on the other side. The next functional category is that corridors can be a source or origin point. A corridor functions as a source when it releases organisms and materials into the adjacent matrix. Corridors are often associated, or rather, corridors are often considered to be sources of weeds and pest species of wildlife, particularly if it's a disturbance corridor, right? Because as we talked about earlier, disturbance corridors like roadways and power lines and things of that nature tend to have a much higher concentration of exotic and invasive species. And so those exotic and invasive species can move out to the adjacent matrix from those corridors. And in that sense, they act as a source of those species, of those pests. They can also be sources of predatory insects and insect-eating birds that keep agricultural crop pests in check. High-quality corridors are much like patches and often serve as sources for wildlife where reproduction in the corridor exceeds mortality and individuals are added to the population. So again, it'll be a source if there is substantial interior habitat along that corridor that can help to sustain populations of individual species. And then the final functional category is that a corridor can act as a sink, in which case that corridor is receiving and retaining organisms and materials that originate in the matrix. And these can be things like seeds from plants in the adjacent matrix. It can be individuals of species that live in the matrix, or it can also be a sink for negative or deleterious materials like pollutants, agricultural chemicals, seeds from invasive species, and other types of materials. The primary controls on each of the functional categories are the properties of width and connectivity. So the wider and more connected the corridor is, the stronger the effect of each of the functions. Conversely, as corridors become narrower and more disconnected, the functions weaken, right? And this is just a diagram that's showing those 5 functional categories for corridors and how they're impacted by width and connectivity. And then when we're trying to assess potential corridor function, it's also important to compare the composition and configuration of the corridor and the similarity of those to the patches that's connecting. So obviously it would be most preferable if you have highly similar compositional and compositional and configurational similarity to the patches that are being connected. However, a corridor can still function to connect those patches even when it has less similarity. But as the similarity goes down, the less functional that corridor is going to be in connecting together those patches, right? And that just kind of makes sense. So for example, if you have a patch of forest and another patch of forest and they're connected together by more forest, by a linear area of forest, that's going to be the ideal type of corridor to have to connect them together. If they're connected together with a hedgerow, let's say, it can still function for some of the species, maybe not all of the species, but it'll still allow for the movement of some of the species and have some more limited connectivity than a more forested type of corridor would. So again, the more similar the corridor to the patches as connecting, the more functionally complete that corridor is going to be. And while we're on the topic of structure, it's important to acknowledge that not all corridors exist as a solid form that passes through the void of a matrix. Corridors are often convex, meaning that they're taller than the surrounding matrix, like a hedgerow along a property line, but they can also be concave, which means that they're lower than the surrounding vegetation, like a strip of meadow between two woodlots. Different species are going to prefer different conditions depending upon their needs. So the top portion is kind of what we typically think of as the, as the more common type of corridor being convex, but the concave also exists in many places, right? So the concave, if you think about like a roadway, for example, that's going to be an example of a concave matrix, typically, where it's the sort of the lower vegetation between the two adjacent areas, and then trees or hedges or other taller plants are going to create a convex corridor. Human-created disturbance or trough corridors like roads and power lines and so forth will most often take that convex form and generally won't suffer from connectivity issues. And in fact, they're almost always completely continuous and present an impassable barrier to wildlife populations that live in the fragmented habitats that remain. Right, so in this case, we're seeing an example of a roadway, which is one type of corridor, and then we have a river, which is another type of corridor. And in this case, the most accessible places for wildlife to get across that barrier presented by the roadway is going to be by going underneath that bridge. But depending on the edge conditions available under the bridge, many terrestrial species might not be able to make it under there if there's strictly water passing through, in which case those species need to cross over the roadway, and that's going to create a barrier where you're going to have roadkill, right? And so species are going to avoid that roadway as a result. The roadway obviously is still acting as a conduit for cars, obviously, but also if we're talking about it from an ecological point of view, it's also a conduit for invasive species, because that's typically what you tend to get along those disturbance corridors. And then they're also acting as a source for erosion and sedimentation as sand and other particulates wash off the roadway. They can become sedimentation in the river below, or as a source for exotic species, or also chemicals and other types of pollutants. This is a phenomenon that you've all probably seen at one point or another, whether it's deer or geese crossing a street. And despite the fact that the corridor is presenting a very dangerous obstacle to wildlife, the need to migrate or find better resources is obviously a very powerful instinct with wildlife. And so they will make the attempt to try to get across that barrier, particularly if it's a narrower barrier that seems like a place that can be safely crossed. On low volume roadways in particular, it's not necessarily a big problem, but it can be a much bigger problem when we're talking about places like highways where you have vehicles that are traveling at a much higher rate. And boy, that little baby moose got really lucky in that case. But this is the kind of thing where you begin to think about how you can accommodate the movement of that wildlife across that barrier, that disturbance corridor that's created by the roadway. And this is a video from up in Alaska. So those two were pretty lucky in this case, but a lot of wildlife are not nearly as lucky. And there's tons of roadkill that happens along highways across the country, particularly in the Western US and our part of the country, where these conflicts between wildlife migration and human movement across the landscape come into stark contrast. So why are these conflicts happening at all? Like, why can't animals simply live in a single patch or habitat for their entire life cycle? So as we've talked about and touched on previously, animals move around the landscape for a number of different reasons, but it all comes down to resource availability and the need for suitable conditions for survival, growth, and reproduction. So there are three general types of movement that are undertaken by animals. The first one is maintenance movement, which refers to the day-to-day movements that are needed by an organism to survive and thrive, such as finding food and mates, parenting behaviors, play behaviors, avoiding becoming prey to predator species, and so forth, right? So those are known as maintenance movements. Next, we have dispersal, which is the movement of an organism or population away from its original home range to colonize new habitats, improve chances of finding a mate, decreasing competition, or other related benefits. And then finally, the third one is migration, which is movement to and from breeding and non-breeding sites, which often involves entire populations that move together over large distances. So those are the three big categories of animal movement across the landscape. And depending on the species, these can be, huge distances that cover hundreds of miles, or they can be very small distances. But all of them need to be considered when we're thinking about land planning and management and how these habitats connect together to provide for all of the different needs of the species in question. And that's why there are so many conflicts between wildlife and human movement, and why wildlife bridges and tunnels have been gaining traction as a cost-effective solution to those points of extreme human-wildlife conflict. These structures allow animals to cross human-made barriers safely, and as we've seen previously with the examples, with other examples in some of the previous slides, these can be a really crucial protection, not just for the wildlife, but also for humans as well. Because when cars come into conflict with animals, it's not just the animals that are getting hurt. You also have property damage, obviously, to the vehicle itself, and oftentimes fatalities if it's a bad enough collision with the wildlife. So these types of wildlife bridges and structures help to protect people as well as wildlife. And so this actually, this need for creating better connectivity between patches for wildlife, particularly along highways, inspired the beginnings of what was known as the ARC International Wildlife Crossing Infrastructure Design Competition. And we're going to now watch a brief video about that competition and about some of the proposals that were made to help better connect together wildlife and do it in a way that is cost effective as well. Because creating these structures is very expensive in most cases. And so finding a cost-effective way to do it will allow for more of them to be built and allow for better connectivity across the disturbance corridors that are created by highways.
Yes, Frosty Mariana. I'm on town council in Carbondale, Colorado. We're a small little town. We have two red lights here in the Roaring Fork Valley between Aspen and Glenwood Springs. Highway 82 has been historically one of the biggest roadkill areas in the state. And so I would see that daily driving from Carbondale to Basalt. I'd see the carnage. I'd see a new animal almost every day that would be hit. And over the last couple of years, that how many people that I've talked to have said, well, I hit an elk in last year and totaled my car. And there's been some tragic accidents from people in wildlife collisions. And again, I mentioned a while ago that you can't put a value on a person's life, but we had a state trooper with two young children that hit a herd of deer a couple of years ago, and it was just a tragic circumstance where he lost his life. And we've had, if you pay attention to these people that get killed and read their stories, I mean, these are all tragedies that could have been prevented, at least 80% of them, with a fencing and crossing strategy.
ARC is about building bridges. It's an international design competition in which we sought creative and innovative solutions for a new type of wildlife crossing infrastructure. At its most basic, it's about reconciling conflict between roads and wildlife, people and animals. It's about getting us all where we need to go safely and at a lower cost. But ARC is more than that. It's also about building bridges between science and policy, between transportation, engineering, ecology, and design, and in the process, reconnecting our landscapes. At the largest level, ARC is about reaffirming the importance of connected, linked landscapes in our culture.
Doing something innovative like the wildlife crossings really is that we're trying to attack the problem from a smarter, more innovative way. What we all know, the highest price we pay is the human toll and lives lost by animal vehicle collisions. But we also know that the cost to repair cars is going up. And an average animal vehicle collision is about $2,900. And the insurance company pays out more than $1 billion a year in claims from animal vehicle collisions. So as we see those costs to repair cars go up, we see the number of animal vehicle collisions go up. That is a price we're all paying for our insurance premiums. So this is, if we can do anything to reduce the number of animal vehicle collisions we have on the roadways, that goes a long way to what we pay out in premiums.
There's a whole new field of context-sensitive solutions where engineers and planners and ecological professionals are working together to try to make sure that wetlands are dealt with, that public impacts are dealt with, and in this case, wildlife impacts are dealt with. So that, again, the highway works with the surrounding environment rather than the highway just being plopped down and everything else suffering.
Well, one of the great challenges of managing National Forest System lands is that we have so many competing values, various things that are of equal importance that we have to consider. Obviously, transportation corridors are important so people can access their public lands and also just to support the economy of this country. At the same time, one of the main reasons people come to places like the state of Colorado is to enjoy the wildlife that exists in such a beautiful, spectacular setting. So anything that helps us bring these competing values into balance is something that's just a huge benefit to the Forest Service in managing public lands.
I think it can be a national example of how, at the same time, we provide a critical piece of our national transportation infrastructure, we can also provide wildlife crossings that allow greater habitat areas for some of our threatened species.
Trying to maintain wildlife connectivity all along I-70 is important. In the 1990s, we kind of termed I-70 as the Berlin Wall for wildlife. Well, if you look at this upper part of Vail Pass, you're looking at almost every species. Vail Pass has the distinction of ending up with a roadkill for all but 3 species of wildlife in Colorado. This location is so important when you look at the development of I-70 from Denver to here. This is one of the few areas that has 2 wildernesses on either side. On the west side, you have the Holy Cross Wilderness, and on the east side, we have the Eagle's Nest. This provides an excellent spot for animals to have that access between those 2 wildernesses. Wildlife is a huge economic driver in Colorado, over $1.8 billion a year. not just in big game, but small game fishing and watchable wildlife. So anything we can do to maintain that diversity and the economic driver along with that connectivity is going to be a key issue for us.
I think encouraging creativity and creative and new approaches from across the world to meet the dual goals that we have with our corridor is a terrific way to get the best ideas from everywhere.
The world animals are typically going to be crossing highways today, may be different 50 or 100 years from now, not only because of changes in vegetation, but also the effect of climate change on vegetation, also species distributions. Traditionally, most wildlife overpasses have been really heavy on the engineering, heavy in terms of the structure, the amount of fill. The wildlife overpasses in Banff have 2 meters of structural fill and topsoil. Nobody's really looked at whether or not these structures could also have less fill, building them lighter, recycled materials, things of that sort, which could lower the cost of wildlife overpasses.
In previous designs for roadway infrastructure, they really haven't involved the design professions per se. They've been designed by transport engineers, and they've been designed in the most expeditious way possible using available technology. And what we sought to do with this design competition was to reach out to the design profession specifically, landscape architecture, design engineering, structural engineering, and ecology. And we require the teams fundamentally to be interdisciplinary. And we were very successful. We attracted over 100 firms on 36 teams who entered the competition. And the 5 finalist teams represent all of those disciplines equally.
We have tried to create a bridge that uses local resources and is sustainable. This low-tech approach, in conjunction with very local available material, can need a small amount of machinery and therefore energy. So we have a CO2 balance of the bridge superstructure, which is either neutral or even positive. The bridge body stores really more CO2 than was needed for production.
Seeing the FAA scurry around deal with bird strike gives us an indication, I think, of how even a much smaller problem can get a tremendous amount of attention. Imagine the value that that crossing has. It certainly pays for itself many times over. And if you think of these costs are every year, so that $8 billion happens year after year, why we're not building many of these wildlife crossings is more the question. If we don't start solving these problems now, I'm afraid they'll only get worse. The other opportunity is to show how successful a wildlife crossing can be at reducing the cost of animal-vehicle conflict.
I think the unique aspect of the Olin plan is that it is modular and adaptable, not just with regard to the structure, but with regard to the landscape itself, so that, in fact, our design solution can become the 21st century solution for the federal highway system. And that is the excitement of the Olin plan that deals with these 2 very different systems, one static system and one living system, but in the context of one form.
We pushed the boundaries by creating a very strong icon that we believed would inspire curiosity and help bring recognition to the wildlife crossing. And we did that by using the color red to achieve this, because red is the only color that most animals do not perceive, but that human beings can see. In a way, it's sort of like a secret code by which you can communicate to people that we share the landscape with other living beings, and that beyond these roads, there exists complex animal habitat that we must be mindful.
One crossing is not enough. You need a network. So we made a solution that is very cost effective, and it can be used in all kinds of situations. It's very light construction. It has a repetitive design elements in it. It's a parametrical design, so you can reuse all the fabric formwork intended for that. And well, it's a very sustainable solution, and you can use it on many spots.
That's a great beauty about them, particularly some of them have managed to achieve beauty through simplicity and delightfulness and playfulness, which is, quite inspiring. I think the whole idea of taking the landscape over the road is very poetic.
We can easily say today, in part based on the success of this competition process, these are no longer design or technical challenges. We have every capacity to implement these kinds of practices. What we really need is political, economic, and social leadership. We can say we have solutions to these problems. These are no longer challenges which exceed professional or technical limits. It has to do with what aspirations our society has.
The important thing about the competition is its assertion of a role for design in a circumstance that's usually built to the lowest common denominator for a basic engineering standard.
The jury was really impressed by the high quality of all of the entries, and after our deliberations, we arrived at a unanimous decision in favor of the entry by HNTB with Michael Van Valkenburg Associates.
I think the most important thing about the winning entry is the way in which it uses ordinary materials in an extraordinary way. And what that does is to create something that's so possible here in this situation that it changes the way we think about what's possible in many, many situations.
So that's an example of how designers are approaching this challenge of trying to provide that connectivity across highways in order to prevent those human vehicle and wildlife interactions that are so costly every year. So as was mentioned, this is a site plan from the winning proposal by HNTB and Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, which details the different elements that make up the wildlife bridge and the plant communities that would be installed on top to accommodate the needs of different wildlife species. And one of the things that you may have noticed with the MVVA entry is that it was one of the few that accommodated movement of different types of species by providing different types of corridors that all sort of interlaced and made their way across that wildlife bridge. So there was a forested corridor, there were more open space corridors, there was a shrubby corridor, and they were looking at all the different types of species that would need to move between the patches on either side of I-70 there up by Aspen. And figuring out what types of environments they need, how they could create corridors that would be most conducive to moving those species across that landscape. But also I think the other reason that this was one of the winning, or that this was the winning entry, is that they were using, they figured out a way to use sort of off-the-shelf construction materials and construction forms that are already available in the trade in terms of highway building to create the structural components of the highway, highway crossing, so that it would be much cheaper and much more readily available materials and easier to build, so that you could deploy more of these more quickly and in more places across the landscape to provide more of these crossings. Right, so again, this is that rendered view in the wintertime that highlights that seamless blend of that new crossing structure with both the highway and also creating as seamless as possible connection between the habitat patches on either side of the highway, so that for the wildlife that are crossing it, it feels like a natural and continuous movement, as opposed to something that's threatening or scary or dangerous that would potentially inhibit the movement of those species. And although roadways are perhaps one of the most glaring examples of that filter barrier effect that corridors have, it's not to say that the filter barrier effect is a universally negative phenomenon. And in fact, in the right setting, it can have a very positive influence on the landscape. In the example of a riparian corridor, for example, a wide and densely vegetated buffer at the edge of the waterway can reduce or completely prevent contaminants from runoff, such as those from roadways or agricultural fields, from reaching the waterway and preventing pollution. Buffers also catch and hold solid particles so they can prevent sedimentation of the waterway. So having characteristics that prevent movement across a landscape isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it can be good when it's deployed properly to protect natural resources. So this is an example of a waterway with its protective buffer adjacent to agricultural fields. And again, the wider and more undisturbed that these buffers can be, the better that the overall health of that riparian ecosystem will be, and the better the connectivity will be between the habitats and the patches that are being connected by these corridors. And that brings us specifically to the subtopic of riparian corridors, which are incredibly important habitats in their own right. And given that they're perhaps the most common type of corridor that we find in the landscape, aside from disturbance corridors like highways, they often impact filtration and wildlife and act as a very important conduit in these human-dominated landscapes where we can find them. So here we have a typical cross-section through a riparian corridor, and this has a waterway edged by sediment and wetland plants with a mix of upland plants in the floodplain, which is contained within the riparian zone. The floodplain in particular is a very important aspect of riparian corridors, as that's the area within which the river is going to meander as its course changes in response to rainfall, snowmelt, floods, and other changing conditions in the physical environment. So we saw an example of this when we were looking at how rivers meander within their floodplain, when we looked at those time lapses of changing landscapes from that project at Columbia University. These diagrams show why allowing floodwater to spread over the floodplain and not channelizing the waterways is so important. Floodwaters that spread out across the floodplain have lower velocity and are less destructive than channelized floodwaters, which travel at a much faster rate and can be explosively destructive, causing extensive erosion along the length of the river corridor and further destabilizing the corridor's ecology. Right? So, and this just kind of makes sense, because if you're forcing more water into a narrower channel, that water is going to move faster, and the faster that water moves, the more destructive it's going to be. Likewise, if you have a much wider area for it to move through, it's going to move more slowly, and it's going to have less destructive impacts. The other thing to realize is the materiality, right? If you have concrete, there's nothing there that's slowing down the movement of the water. It is just going to travel basically as, as fast as gravity will allow. And again, that faster water is going to have greater impacts. Whereas if you have a vegetated floodplain corridor, that vegetation and the roots in the soil and rocks and other materials like that, they slow down the movement of the water. And so you have less flooding downstream, you have less impacts from the actual movement of the water in terms of destroying homes and bridges and roadways and things of that nature. So, so having a nice wide naturalized floodplain is always going to be much more sustainable than having a narrow and paved or hardscape type of a floodway. These two diagrams these are plan diagrams that show the needed corridor width to adequately maintain a stream or river corridor. Both of them include the entire riparian zone plus more upland areas, all the way up to the upland edge with the matrix. And these also show how much the waterway can meander within the floodplain. The added element in the river corridor plan is an alternating quote unquote ladder pattern of bands of natural vegetation that provide conduits for upland species to get across that corridor, but also help mitigate the effects of large flood events, because again, that vegetation is going to slow down the movement of the water when you do have a flood event. That also helps to trap materials that can improve localized habitats. So that natural vegetation are places where you'll naturally collect sedimentation, and that helps build these sort of islands of terrestrial habitat that can be helpful for wildlife to move across that river channel. And then finally, this diagram illustrates the importance of having continuously vegetated riparian corridors to provide secondary benefits like shading and water temperature maintenance. This environment along the edges is needed in order to protect various aquatic species such as trout. So that's another benefit that we often don't think about, is that the buffers to that riparian corridor are actually helping to modulate the temperature of that waterway. And if waterways get too hot, there are certain species of fish and other aquatic species that can't survive well in the higher temperatures. It's also important to note that higher temperature water doesn't hold as much oxygen. So when the water gets too warm, even if species can, they can live with the higher temperatures, it might make it more difficult for them to survive due to lower oxygen content. So all of the shading that's provided by trees around a vegetated stream corridor are going to help with both the temperature and the oxygen content in that water. So this is an example of a functioning riparian corridor with an appropriate buffer provided on both sides of it that's going to help to mitigate the impact of the land use adjacent to it, and also provide for wildlife to be able to utilize that corridor as connectivity with other patches. So you can see in this example, not only is this riparian corridor providing connectivity along the length of the corridor, but also across it, because it connects to habitat patches on either side of the river as well. And I think we will probably cut it off there. So we'll come back to talk about corridor connectivity next week. And actually, let me see. Yeah, I keep I keep being off by just a little bit, by like 5 or 6 slides. So sorry for the way that these lectures are kind of awkwardly spanning multiple classes. But anyway, we'll come back and finish this one up. And what I would like to mention are 2 things. One is, who knows what's happening 2 weeks from today?
Test.
At test, that's right. Exam number 2 is 2 weeks today. It's on April 1st. And no, that is not a joke. It is really happening on April 1st. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The second thing to be aware of is that in lieu of class on Monday, or maybe I should do it Thursday. Never mind, we'll do it Thursday. We're gonna have a film to watch on Thursday, but we'll still meet for class on Tuesday next week so that I can finish the corridor presentation. And you're going to have 2 assigned things after that, which will be a reading. The reading is actually going to be assigned today. I'll post that to Canvas right after class. It's about animal movement across the landscape and the different types of movement and how the landscape helps to inhibit or what's the other word? Make better. I'm losing my vocabulary. Inhibit or promote movement across the landscape. Okay. But anyway, that reading will be posted right after class today. And I will see you guys on Tuesday. So have a good weekend. Happy belated St. Patrick's Day. And I hope you all have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.